30-minute hybrid session that will be looking at volunteering for resilience from a Pacific perspective. My name is Alana Smith, and I, along with Gabrielle Mara, will be your moderators for this session. Just a brief introduction for myself. I'm based in the Cook Islands and work for a non-government environmental organisation called Te Pukaria Society. Our NGO work across a range of different environmental areas, from youth to biodiversity, climate change and waste management. We are also the BirdLife partner for the Cook Islands, as well as the only IUC member for the Cook Islands. Just briefly, those videos you all saw before, those were recent ocean health awareness raising programs that our society were able to do alongside other 3 stakeholders. And of course, we know our traditional voyages, they all work on a volunteer basis throughout the Pacific. So that was just a bit of insight to that. Gabrielle, if you can introduce yourself, please, our second moderator for today.
Thank you very much, Lana. Bula Vinaka, everyone. Bula from Fiji. I am your co-facilitator and moderator. Second one for this dialogue. I am currently a UNV based at the Resident Coordinator's Office at the MCO in Fiji. I am the Information Management Specialist and continue to look after the UN's work in the Pacific. Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed today's dialogue. Thank you. Back to you, Alana.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Okay, during this virtual event, we have 5 speakers from across the Pacific that will be speaking to the role of volunteers and how volunteers continue to contribute their expertise towards strengthening Pacific Islands' resilience towards natural disasters. Pacific development practitioners argue that there needs to be a whole bottom-up approach to complement policies and plans targeted to building resilience. In the Pacific, volunteers are well known, well recognized for developing local solutions and strengthening relationships between community members and external stakeholders, which facilitate the delivery of major projects. Today's session, we will unpack the requirements needed to sustain a resilient system and the critical role that volunteerism plays in this. Our objectives for this session will be to examine volunteering for resilience in the context of the Pacific. We have 6 presenters here today who have 5 minutes to present. So speakers, just some housekeeping rules to ensure we keep to proper time management. I will interject at the 4-minute mark just to give a 1-minute warning. And then, okay, so once we've listened to all our speakers, we will then have about 20 minutes for questions and answers once all our presenters have spoken. So for our audience today, if you have any questions, please do put those in the chat and we will try and get to those questions at the end. Finally, speakers, just a quick reminder to keep your videos on when you're presenting. You don't have to have them on now, just when you're presenting, and keep yourself muted if you are not speaking. To kickstart our session, we have our opening remarks via a pre-recorded video from Shalina Mia. Shalina is the Regional Manager for Asia Pacific for the United Nations Volunteers Program. Previously, she was the Chief of Partnerships in UNV, responsible for leading resource mobilization and partnerships building. She has also worked in UNCDF, UNDP, Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank and private law firms. Now, I'll just try and get this video playing.
Partners, volunteers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to join you today at this vlog, Volunteering for Resilience. I would like at the outset to thank the Asian Development Bank and the German International Cooperation Agency for organizing this event and creating a space to share views and voices from diverse stakeholders in the region. For the United Nations Volunteers Program, it is an important opportunity to join forces with partners in the Pacific to bring attention to the importance of volunteering in the context of climate action under the Agenda 2030 and people's resilience in changing their lives as the climate changes. I'm also excited to open this discussion by talking about why volunteering and volunteerism are crucial for resilient societies. Especially, I thank our speakers today from Fiji, Kiribati, Palau, Samoa, and Tuvalu, who will share their experience and views with us on the values of volunteering in addressing climate change and building resilience as a whole of society from various aspects, including gender, youth, and persons with disabilities. Today's dialogues will focus on two important concepts. The first is volunteering, a core value of the United Nations Volunteers Program and the mandate we have been entrusted with by the UN General Assembly. Volunteering, which is embedded in values of kindness, respect, a human-centered construct that creates and sustains a resilient society and reinforces. Volunteering is distinguished by the second concept of resilience, as it does not demand time or funds. The importance of volunteering for resilience goes beyond protecting the environment, reducing disaster risks, and promoting social and economic inclusion. As you know, the COP26 summit will bring partners together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. As the theme of today's event is volunteering for resilience, I must also add that while not explicitly mentioning volunteers, the paper recognizes that participatory approaches to climate change mitigation and adaptation are important to track progress, hold stakeholders to account, and fill urgent knowledge gaps to inform decision-making and raise awareness. The UNV flagship publication, The State of the Volunteerism Report 2018, titled The Thread That Binds Volunteerism and Community Resilience, points out that incidents of instability have become more frequent and intense in many countries. Such incidents, from those related to climate change and natural disasters to conflict and dislocation, have created multiple vulnerabilities, even in countries with a long history of financial and political stability. As global systems and structures have become more interdependent, the prerequisites for development include the ability to resolve conflict and sustain peace, the ability to prepare for and absorb shocks, and the ability to establish sustainable development processes that work for all people and groups, both now and in the future. This report also proves how volunteering can sow the seeds of resilience in people and their communities. It clearly acknowledges how volunteers come together for the common good and use their own capacity to organize in times of crisis. The report also demonstrates that the world's 1 billion volunteers are not just a major resources in time of crisis, but that volunteerism is itself a property of resilient communities. I believe volunteering is resilient in itself. A vocation passes on from generation to generation and very much a human nature or in our DNA because of the values of kindness, respect, charity, and giving. And if we look at the Pacific, it is no secret that in the Pacific, volunteers are well recognized for developing local solutions and strengthening relationships between community members and external stakeholders. A telling example is the post-cyclone Winston experience, where thousands of volunteers offered their time to support emergency response and disaster recovery. Many may not be aware of the behind-the-scenes work that volunteers were involved in, such as the provision of relocation support to affected community, coordination of relief supplies, to name a few. As such, today's dialogue will focus on the narratives of volunteers in the process of building resilience, including how they navigate through different phases of disasters. In recognition of the stark messages highlighted within the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, there is an urgent need to commit resources towards building resilience through volunteering. This includes channeling climate finance for specific adaptation and mitigation measures at the individual, community, and national levels, and in the mobilization of volunteers who apply local solutions to address challenges. In the lead up to the global negotiations as you discussed today, if it is worth unpacking on what is required to sustain a resilient system and what it would look like, I hope this serves as food for thought during your discussion. Once again, thank you to everyone who took the time to organize this event, which is timely and very important. I wish you have a very fruitful discussion and let the Pacific voice be heard wide and far. Thank you very much.
All right, I will pass that on to you now, Gabby, to introduce our first speaker.
Testing, can you hear me? Right. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this conversation on volunteering for resilience in the context of the Pacific. Now we start with the plenary. Allow me to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Fetomi Kapungili, community and gender expert in Pacific Studies based in Samoa. Fetomi, or Taomi as she is known to her colleagues, earned her PhD in Pacific Studies from the University of Otago. Her thesis focused on Tuvaluan communities in Samoa and Fiji and their ethnic identity and belongingness in the diaspora within Oceania. She earned her master's with honors in Pacific Studies and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Anthropology from the University of Auckland. She worked as an academic director for SEAT in Fiji from 2005 to 2011. She has experience working within the CSO sector in Fiji and helped found 2 local NGOs that specialize in conflict transformation and peace building in the Pacific. Taomi also worked with the Pacific Conference of Churches as a lecturer at the Pacific Theological College. Her voluntary work has concentrated on issues such as HIV and AIDS, poverty alleviation, youth and women's empowerment, and advocacy and community education. Ladies and gentlemen, I will hand over to Taomi. I think you're currently unmuted.
Unmute. Okay, apologies. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and hear you well and clear.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm now trying.
From there, thank you.
Okay, so does my screen look like a PowerPoint presentation?
It does, yeah.
Oh, awesome. All right, so to volunteer for resilience is contextual. Volunteering in the Pacific occurs in lived social spaces, which are both complex and dynamic, and places in which community approaches have a key role to play in sustainability and resilience thinking, according to Latai Nusulu's recent research. I propose here a nuanced notion of volunteering, which enables the volunteer to be resilient in spaces that epitomize resilience. Tautua volunteerism embodies culturally responsive, faith-based approaches that engender resilience in Pacific communities. To volunteer is a natural response for any Samoan. It is tautua or service, a reminder to Samoans that the main qualification for leadership is service to the community. All Indigenous Pacific communities have tautua equivalents, such as Vengaravi or Yaloni Vengaravi in Fiji. These responses come naturally to Indigenous Pacific people because they manifest service to one's family or one's community. Our understanding of volunteerism is steeped in traditional knowledge constructs that espouse values of service to family, born out of love, alofa or yalololoma. And this also takes in faith-based perspectives of service to others. In Samoa, resilience in post-natural disaster utilizes both cultural and faith-based approaches and structures. And these are the pillars of a Samoan person's identity or personhood that inculcate and that a Samoan reaches out to in order to make decisions of personal and group resilience. The Samoa Nurses Association of New Zealand's response to the tsunami of 2009 and the doctors and nurses who came in droves to assist during the 2019 measles epidemic are examples of Samoan volunteers from the diaspora. The mobilization of Samoan medical personnel as volunteers for resilience was deemed the appropriate cultural response to natural disaster and a national public health emergency. These Samoans volunteered because of their understanding of tautua, premised on alofa. The basis of the Samoa or our Samoan culture, like the Vakaviti, is alofa. And this itself is the fundamental doctrine of all, I believe, faith organizations, of faith itself. And that is love. The churches here in Samoa have provided shelter, support in times of crisis, facilitated the development of social capital, and often introduced relevant external knowledge to communities. And as for Samoans, ways of being resilient in the face of extraordinary challenges are found in the whaamatai, our chiefly systems, structures of extended families, villages, church groups, and in external connections with the government and agencies. So in order for volunteerism to be responsive to the Pacific, volunteer for resilience interventions must foster and incorporate the essence of tautua and alofa, and it must seek to inculcate values, structures, frameworks from within to be our homegrown sustainable solutions and approaches. And it must also be mindful that you operate in spaces that are lived social spaces, that are dynamic, that are complex. And as a consequence, and it's filled with people who are resilient as a consequence of interactions and adaptations over millennia. And such people themselves have nuanced resiliency that, if holistically grasped, could enrich your volunteerism experience. Whakataitele lava. I don't know how to stop sharing, sorry.
That's a very interesting presentation. Yeah, thank you for speaking to us on the culture of volunteering framework. Volunteer about services, culturally responsive, and a faith-based approach, like you described with Alofa and Yellow Lolong. I think this is evidence of another beautiful part of our culture and faith in this. So thank you very much on speaking to us. To introduce our second speaker, Lepani Bunjurang, our community volunteer for Honor Foundation. Lepani is a youth volunteer as a volunteer to the Honor Foundation and partnership with North American domestic community. Its primary focus is providing education needs on the island of Kandar. Foundation has since expanded as well as aiding for centralized families and VTF. Together with this, he is also the youth president of Calvary Temple, one of his largest churches with over 1,000 members in various ministries. In this, he formulates programs that promote spiritual, mental, and emotional development of young people, as well as career and financial. With this, I will now hand over to Lepani.
Thank you, Mr. Mara, and also thank you to the organizers for putting together this event. Mr. Mara, can you confirm if you can hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Alana. Once again, good morning, and also good afternoon, good evening to all of those who are tuning in from the Pacific and from around the world. My name is Lepani Bunturanga, and as what Mr. Mara said, that I'm a community volunteer with Honor Foundation Fiji, and I'm also I just started with UN OCHA as a UNV. My presentation today will be on youth's community volunteering in Fiji, and also how it has shaped communities, and also to help them to be more resilient, and also putting in sustainable work in the community levels, especially in the grassroots and the villages. So to start off, volunteering in the Pacific context, as we all know, volunteering is weaved into our culture. For example, Sole Solevaki, which is a Fijian term, meaning for us to work together for the common good or for the greater good. Regardless of the situation, regardless of the task that's been there, we can mobilize people to come together to do for the greater good, for the communities, for the towns, and for the families. So yes, volunteering is weaved into our culture. And also the communal living has been a traditional characteristic of life in the Pacific, as the UNV head in the Asia Pacific region has said that volunteerism is not a new thing in the Pacific. It's a part of our life. It's a traditional characteristic that we all live in. And for examples, there are collective events, village fundraising. And yes, of course, this communal living type of living that we have in the Pacific does complement volunteering. And of course, the local solutions practiced in the community levels in the Pacific through volunteering are sustainable, and they do build stronger and resilient communities. So over the years, 50, 100 years ago, local solutions have been working, and they've been working until now, since the challenges and we have new challenges that we now face as a as young people in this season where we are facing climate change, disasters, and many more technological and hazards and disasters, we are more prone and exposed to new things. So the spirit of volunteering in today's world and what is being done with volunteers that have been helping communities in the Fiji and also in the Pacific. Youth volunteers are in the forefront of building resilient communities, leveraging their capacity, their passion, and their networks for the greater good. Young people have used technology, have used social media to mobilize resources and to mobilize people for the greater good in different places around Fiji. Some of the examples that I'm going to use here are from pages on Twitter groups. I know most people in Fiji are aware that volunteers have been gathered in their province. So we have the Hakwa Gang, which is a group, a province from Nandrongai and Navosa, the Yoba from the Mba province, and the Manunduitangi from the Kandavu, have all been very instrumental in the relocation support and coordination of relief supplies. So this is a perfect example of how young people are using social media, other social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Some of them have never even met, but they've come together for the greater good to assist those who are in local communities, in the villages, those who have been affected by climate change, sea level rising, relocation, and also by cyclones. As we all know, the Pacific is prone to many cyclones, and as of 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we have now just entered into the cyclone season. So, spirit of volunteering in today's world, the youths right now in the Fiji and the Pacific are in the forefront of this, and these are some of the perfect examples of how youths have been very effective in providing relief support and building resilient communities across Fiji and across the Pacific. And also bridging the gap, I'll just share a short story of Ono Foundation, which is the foundation that I currently coordinate, and I'm just going to address in terms of bridging the gap when international and local communities work together in making a positive impact on the society. So the Ono Foundation Fiji story. Ono Foundation is a foundation based in America with Fijian members who are there as citizens who give and donate out of their free will and in the spirit of volunteering to see a greater good being done in Fiji. And also the communities in Fiji, we have volunteers, we have representatives here on the ground, on the grassroots level that implement the work that has been done. So in US, they mobilize finances and resources, and in Fiji, they mobilize the volunteers and the community engagement that has been done in Fiji. And also this comes together and working together with the international and the community volunteers come together to impact communities through providing education needs and supporting in disaster relief support in towns and cities and villages. So this is just one of the many examples of how volunteering in the Pacific has been shaped and how it has adapted to helping a bigger picture, a bigger number of people in Fiji, where we get community volunteers and overseas Pacific Islanders, the diaspora, to come together and also to help those who are really in need. And we have the case here with the Ono Foundation Fiji, helping in with education and also with relief support. And yes, this is just one of the many examples of how volunteerism has been helping communities to be more resilient, to assist them in times of need. Also important is filling in the gaps where there is service delivery, the gaps there is. Volunteerism fills that gap very well, and also to help them in terms of the preparedness work, but also important is for us to empower the young people to take initiatives, to be problem solvers, and also to be solution driven. So yes, all in all, in the Pacific, volunteers have shown passion, they have shown the will to serve, and they have the heart to see the greater good being done in the Pacific. And this is just one of the examples of many organizations, groups that do carry out volunteerism in the Pacific. And yes, the bottom-up approach can work, and in terms of influencing policies, influencing government decisions, and also bringing community solutions in the national level. So yes, once again, all in all, that's just a short presentation of what volunteering in the Pacific, as we have the likes of the groups on Twitter and Ono Foundation can do in the Pacific. with many more examples that have not been mentioned are doing the same thing. So once again, thank you very much, and vinakavakalev.
Testing, can you hear me?
Yes, much better now, Gabby.
Yeah, so I'll just keep my video off to help with the bandwidth. But thank you, Vinakavale for sharing your insights while working on the ground, the work you do with Honor Foundation. I'm sure Honor Foundation and others you've mentioned, like the Hakonandro, they're making, they're carrying a good momentum in the work they do here, especially for disaster relief. And you spoke on Czechoslovakia. I thought that was very interesting. And like Dr. Talmi mentioned in a presentation earlier, in the Pacific, we have the equivalence of Tautua, like in Samoa, and we have the same here for the region in the Pacific. So thank you very much for sharing and speaking on that. And without further ado, I'll move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Ray Bateni. Hello and Maori Ray. Ray is a Pacific Youth Council member and a Pacific climate warrior. Ray is not new to the youth development space in the Pacific, having been involved in climate change movements in small island developing states. Ray is a member of the Pacific Youth Council and is from Kiribati. Thank you very much, Ray. I'll now hand over to you. Trying for Ray one more time. Okay. All right, we can see that Ray is not with us this morning. All right, moving on. Let me introduce Vilene. Vilene is an advocate for persons living with disability based in Palau. Ali, and welcome, Vilene. Vilene has been a powerful advocate for disabled people across the Pacific for more than 2 decades. She has served as the secretary and president of a disabled persons organization in Palau. Volunteering at a young age sparked her interest in disabilities and human rights issues as a result of her involvement with NGOs and community work. Among her greatest achievements was bringing together partners and securing Palau's ratification of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So over to you, Vilene.
Thank you, Gabby. I'll start to share my screen. Yeah. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, you can see your screen.
Okay.
Good morning. PowerPoint, Vilene, enlarge.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay. Good morning, colleagues. Yes, I'm a person with physical disability, and I will be talking about how we can make an environment inclusive, not just for persons with disabilities, but for everyone, including children, women, and other and young people as well. So my presentation is more focused on inclusion of persons with disabilities, but it's also when we say removing barriers, inclusion of persons with disability, that will also impact, benefit other groups such as young people, women, children, and others. So we can say persons with disabilities are those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. I'm not going to briefly touch on this I want to give the slides that more of relate to the other groups. So the type of the impairments, there is physical, sensory, intellectual, psychosocial. But this one, I want to focus more because it affects other groups. When we say barriers, we can say there is an attitude. There's also stigma and discrimination for all groups in the community, for children, youth, and women. There's also physical environment barriers. There's also communication, which we don't have access to communication in accessible way that we can access. There's also discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. I'm giving you a bit of a background on what are these barriers that are impacting such vulnerable groups in the community. So in a way, for persons with disability, we have an impairment plus the barriers in the community that will equal to disability. So long ago, we always say charity approach, medical approach, where we treat persons with disabilities, women, girls, well, young people, they're poor, so we have to help them. We feel sorry for them. We have to feed them. We have to also ensure that we have to fix them if they are somehow different from a person, from other people in the community, so they can participate. These are the consequences of charity medical approaches where we see stigma, segregation, dependence. Social approach, now we move like, oh, these are people, they have the rights, they have to go to hospital, they have to go to school. So we eliminate those barriers for them to be able to go to hospital or go to school. Beyond social approach, we need to ensure that the children, women, young people, persons with disability, they all have rights as other people in the community. So we're talking about equal participation, non-discrimination, and there is also Convention on the Rights of Children, Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So the key principles of a human rights approach, we're talking about inclusion, participation, accessibility, non-discrimination, respect for difference and diversity, equality of opportunities, respect for inherent dignity. Of course, we always refer to the person to maintain their dignity and respect and treat people equally, but we don't use over words such as you're brave, you're courageous, just treat people equally. So the main part of this presentation is what is inclusion? Everyone has multiple characteristics such as age, gender, wealth, ethnicity. Some individuals may be less to participate in and benefit from community activities or access services based on their particular characteristics or circumstances, break down barriers and help to enable all characteristics or circumstances to participate. So in the disability sector, we say preconditions for inclusion. But I want to touch in this diagram. We don't want to exclude people, women, children, persons with disabilities, youth. We don't want to segregate them in a separate bubble. We don't want to integrate them in our bubble. We want to include them. So this is how the picture of the inclusion, where everyone are inside one bubble so that they can enjoy in the community, participate in the community, and be included in the community on an equal basis with others. So for the disability sector, so we have persons with disabilities plus preconditions, equal opportunities. So we can also substitute with children, with youth, with women. So how to include them? Of course, for persons with disabilities, we need to ensure that they have access. There is assistive device, support systems, there is community-based inclusive development, non-discrimination, and social protection. Of course, when you say accessible, it means that persons with disabilities is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without disability. Assistive devices, for myself, I'm using wheelchair, so that's my assistive device. Believe it or not, your eyeglasses is also an assistive device. You can also see other devices that are used by older people, by women as well, and by children. So when we say, this is also more particularly for other vulnerable groups. So we don't just, ensure that they have access to health education, but they also have, beyond their basic services, their livelihood, their social protection, and empowering these vulnerable groups in the community so that they be able to contribute in the society and participate in the society. Social protection, not only disability allowance or other form of money schemes, but as well as to ensure that they are able to have access to other social protection. Support services for persons with disability. We need other carers or personal assistant to assist. Like for myself, I need a personal assistant to assist myself, to assist me so I can perform my work and be able to contribute and participate in society. For persons with vision impairments, they also need sighted guide people to help them, guide them. And also for deaf persons, they need sign language interpreters. So this is non-discrimination, how it means. So in the left picture, we see persons with disability segregated and persons without disability on another side. But for the right photo, we see diversity of people. And so we have persons with disabilities, we see men, women, and you can see also children. So this is how we say inclusion, diversity of people. That's all, folks. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Vilene. Thank you very much for speaking to us on this. And and thank you for the work you've done and continue to do in this space. I couldn't agree more on the inclusion of people living with disabilities that is non-discriminatory, identifying the barriers that currently exist, and as you said, not segregating, not integrating, but including. Thank you very much, Vilene. With that, I will now introduce our fifth and final speaker, Dr. Lau Williamu Yese. Dr. Williamu is a resilience expert in climate change based here in Suva, Fiji. In addition to his work on climate change, Dr. Willi has worked on food security, disaster risk management, and was recently appointed as the senior lecturer in disaster risk management at the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development, or PACE-SD in short, at the University of the South Pacific. Willi joined a few researchers to publish a report on focus on the intersections, roles of churches and church organizations in localization of climate change, disaster risk management, and humanitarian actions in Fiji. The research and publication of Dr. Yese span many areas, including risk resilience in agriculture, food security, climate change losses and damages, and adaptation in Pacific Island countries. In addition to being a member of the Pacific Resilience Partnership, Dr. Yese is also chair of the Pacific Soil Partnerships Research Pillar. He was born in Samoa. Willi is a citizen of Tuvalu and currently resides in Fiji. With that, ladies and gents, I welcome and hand over to Dr. William.
Thank you very much, Honorable Moderator Mara. It's a pleasure to be here today. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Dr. Willi. Thank you.
Wonderful. Right. Yeah. I also want to thank the organizers for this important session, for inviting me to speak. I am very happy to volunteer to speak about this today. I do not have a presentation, but I just want to share some thoughts on on how to improve volunteerism for resilience in Pacific Island countries. But first, I want to recognize and congratulate all volunteers, Malo and Minaka Vakalevu. I also want to mention that I wholeheartedly agree with the presentations and what was said by my esteemed panelists in this important session. So 100% I am with you. The culture of resilience, which is a culture of anticipating risks and act accordingly to reduce risks, prepare to respond and recover better in Pacific Island countries, is based on the values of communalism, reciprocity, love thy neighbor as thyself, benefits of many over the individual, including benefits to the environment. And this has been covered really well by the earlier speakers, understanding the context of where resilience is happening. And the culture of resilience is built on the strength of collective action and volunteerism. And one of the 7 principles of systemic resilience, which is broadened participation, it implies that everybody has a role to play. And Pacific communities are structured in a way to encourage everyone to play their part in preparedness, respond and recovery, as well as understanding risks, vulnerability, and exposure. So that is very, very important. I just want to briefly share some key aspects from the study that was conducted with ADRA on roles of the churches in localization of climate change and disaster risk management in Fiji. And it's very, very critical, as also mentioned earlier. The roles of churches and community volunteers is very diverse. It can be from raising awareness, doing the trainings, mobilizing all the volunteers and the communities. They are early responders and they wear different hats at different times. So everybody and anybody can be a volunteer at that setting. And their network of churches facilitated by the Church Agency Network, disaster operation, what you can do, contributed in building the resilience of church-based volunteers. And one important role, this is very significant, that stood out for me, is the provision of psychosocial support. The church ministers and church-based volunteers were trained to provide psychosocial support, which is good, excellent. But the problem is that no one is providing the psychosocial support for the church ministers, the leaders, and the volunteers. So they mentored, they counseled the people affected by the disasters, but no one counseled them. So they carry the mental health burdens of the population for long. So in order to do these roles, the volunteering well and better, training is needed, availability is needed, creating pathways for professionalism, especially for youth, like internship and such opportunities is also needed because the pathway is very important. Support mechanisms for mental health is needed. Seeing death, destructions, violence takes a toll on volunteers. And these type of impacts are unseen impacts that live long, sometimes longer than the volunteers. So this is very crucial to bring into the conversation. Resourcing is needed, even to cover food and transportation, and also mobilization is not cheap in the modern world. In a cultural context, it was quite okay because we just cook some food and everybody eats and happy. But in this modern world, with cash economies, there is a need for a lot of resourcing. Maybe in developed countries' context, they have savings or benefits or other sources of social welfare to support the volunteers. And many of the volunteers are young people or retired workers. But in Pacific Island countries, the spirit of volunteerism, sad to say, is declining, especially in urban areas and settlements. I think it is not because of the lack of will, but it is a lack of understanding of the roles of volunteers and pathways for volunteerism, and especially many competing priorities, education, work, farming, church choir, sports. The last two are the important ones, the important disruptions, the nightclubs and the video games. To be honest, I was taught by many Peace Corps and volunteers growing up in Samoa, so I really appreciate their contribution in building the capacity of our Pacific Island people. So huge whaftai for their hard work and commitment. So a couple of guiding questions here is, how could we revive the spirit of volunteerism in Pacific Island countries to promote resilience at home? And how could we rekindle the spirit and commitment of volunteerism in urban areas and settlements to promote resilience? And I always say that volunteerism has to come from within. And the learning by doing, or seeing the value and the joy of volunteerism is just by being a volunteer. And there is a need, I think, to establish a form of governance mechanism for volunteerism for resilience in the islands. Maybe an inventory of who's doing what, where, when, why, and available resources. This helps to align the actions, harmonize actions, and improve efficiency. And working with faith-based organizations, as we've heard, volunteer-based organizations, and local communities, as shared by my fellow colleagues, and also including youth groups, people living with disabilities, and women's organizations, or the very community themselves, is needed. And this is where the power of outreach, or what I call discipleship for volunteers, is important. There's also a need to look at many developing standards, or maybe developing standards for volunteerism or standard operation procedures, especially for building resilience, because resilience building needs standards and the right form of knowledge creation, generation, brokerage, and transference of such knowledge. And maybe there should be a specific accredited training process for volunteers to acquire specific skills needed to build resilience at a community level, island level, national level, and the regional level. If you are an untrained volunteer in a resilience context, you might add to the vulnerability of communities and also putting yourself at risk. I always say an untrained volunteer is a very high risk volunteer. I have seen this in action in the communities, especially during the search and rescue and the humanitarian actions area. COVID-19 has shown once again two important lessons. One is that the strength of traditional systems, land sharing, sharing of labor, as a collective actions, for example, as mentioned earlier, the Sole Solevaki in Fiji, contribute to building resilience. The strength of localization of action in the countries to build resilience to cyclones, floods, and climate change is really, really important. And both of these examples depended on the spirit of volunteerism, collective action, and mobilization of communities. But all of these need skills, values, and knowledge systems to operationalize. Then how could we mobilize non-traditional organizations to volunteer? Jesuit institutions like the University of the South Pacific, where I work, including the schools, the retired citizens with so much knowledge there to tap on. How could we utilize their skills to support resilience buildings? We do not have many people in our Pacific Islands. We are seats and huge, large ocean states. Utilizing available people as much as we could is needed. I know there is a focus on knowledge brokerage, but I encourage volunteers and partners to be involved in knowledge creation and transference of that knowledge through participatory research and capacity building itself. We have seen this as well in our program, researching with farmers, researching with fisher folks, researching involving women and the local volunteers. So when that knowledge is created and transferred to the people who will apply the knowledge, they really understand where the knowledge came from. So there is a contextualization and localization of that knowledge. So that is very important. I have seen in our own, we call them Shining Star volunteers, our student associations at the University of South Pacific and Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development, their role in knowledge creation, in knowledge brokerage and transference of that knowledge to their own peers and members of their households and the communities. So they have mobilized and used their allowances to purchase food items and fundraise to help other fellow students who were affected by COVID-19. And they also help to support the recovery of our communities. Finally, safety and welfare of volunteers is critical. It doesn't mean they are called volunteers, then they should not be looked after. Financially, the human security, psychosocial support, and knowledge and skill set. They are contributing to building resilience of the communities and our homes. So the resilience of volunteers is paramount here as well. And given that we are talking about volunteerism for resilience to disasters and climate change, I really urge all listeners and those who are from the big greenhouse gas emitting countries to please, in the spirit of volunteerism, volunteer to cut your emissions and limit the heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius so that our Pacific Island countries, people, environment, and cultures of resilience will continue to exist now and into the future. And we should all volunteer to save the Pacific and save the world. Thank you very much.
Dr. Will, thank you very much for speaking on this. Systematic resilience, and everyone has a role. You're right, especially in the Pacific, we are structured in that way, a Pacific society, to perform our role. Yeah, and the two other points that spoke out to me when you were talking was on psychosocial support for those that provide the mental support or help in communities like pastors or members of the church, or even community elders who provides support to them, and they carry society's mental load. In the same way, for volunteers, their safety and the psychosocial support all contribute to the resilience of these volunteers. And these volunteers, they contribute to the resilience of communities. So thank you very much for speaking on that. Yeah, and with that, Dr. Willie was our fifth and final speaker. We will jump right into our Q&A session. Just continuing on Dr. Willie. So right off the cuff, we have a question here. I'll pitch this right to you, but it's also open for the rest of the speakers to speak on as well before we dive into the rest. The first one will be on how does volunteering and volunteers for resilience in the Pacific, how can they leverage local solutions to attain the SDGs? And how can volunteering or volunteer drives, they can drive local solutions towards SDGs in the Pacific? I'll also put this in the chat, the question in the chat. So over to you, Dr. Willie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tamara, for a very important question, linking volunteerism and getting the solutions and leveraging local solutions for SDGs. I think the two important angles or pathways that I look at it is the volunteers themselves are from the communities, from households, from communities, from villages in Pacific Island countries. And the second important thing about it is, as a teacher myself, it's very important to recognize and identify the knowledge system that are needed in order to link this volunteer work in fulfillment or the in alignment with different SDGs. As I mentioned earlier, that they wear different hats at different times, and at the household level, it's not sectoral. Like governments, there are different sectors that look after different priorities. But at the household level, at the community level, everyone looks after everything. So the one that looks after water is also the one that gets the food, the one that brings the income home, the one that cooks the food. So, so at the household level, it's very important to recognize that. And I think once we have the recognition of the role of the volunteers at the household level in linking up to different thematic areas of the SDGs, and then we look at how to to building that knowledge systems that will help to facilitate the volunteering work. And I say this from our research students that I was talking about earlier, from the Pacific, in the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development. Remember, they are researchers, but they are also members of the youth groups and the women groups in their own villages. So some of them are studying mangroves here for their masters as well, and they have identified the different values of these mangroves or looking after the mangroves in achieving different types of or the different targets for the SDGs. So when they go back to their communities, they also help to educate the communities and bringing up these youth, bringing up the knowledge systems and the information and the awareness of the youth groups who are volunteers at the village, and putting them in a situation where they are ready to be activated, where they are ready to do the action, whether there is a project to contribute to that, or whether they have that knowledge and action it. I think that is very important. To me, the most important thing there is to get that level of knowledge, get that level of awareness in our volunteers, and inspire them to do the work, starting from their homes, starting from their communities, whether it's a project-based or not. And then it will trickle all the way up to the national level. We build from the basic unit of our system, which is the household itself. That's what I'm thinking now, Mr. Maro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vili, and for sharing your insights on that, especially from the subunit of family and building on that. Thank you. Dr. Taomi, we have a question here for you. I'll also put it in the chat. It's on how can governments recognize the value of volunteering, and what can we do to bring this out, and particularly for women? Dr. Taomi, over to you.
I'm sorry. I was trying to. So how can governments recognize volunteers, and especially the contribution of women? Well, they'd have to. How can governments do anything? Well, here in Samoa, we'd have to, sorry, I'm trying to be politically correct. So governments need to take on the belief and the understanding that volunteerism is a groundswell movement that actually can be incorporated into the national structures and provide space for it, especially, and also women have a huge contribution. A lot of their work is the volunteering that goes on behind the scenes, and that is unheard of and unrecognized and undervalued. Our Ministry for Women, communities and social development, say for instance here in Samoa, they could be at the helm of ensuring that structures are put in place to make sure that the contributions of these members of society that far outweigh, that is a huge contribution to how our communities operate and are successful. If they could be mandated and streamlined and made a part of the structures that already exist, that could be a huge step in the right direction. For far too long, women's work has been undervalued, underappreciated, and their contribution as volunteers, because everyone knows the backbone of our societies, especially here in Samoa, are our women, strong Samoan women who have contributed as sisters, as mothers, as aunts, as women in government, as women leaders. Our contribution is huge, and our contribution as volunteers is even huger, as members of our families, as members of our churches, of our communities. If those efforts could be, and the successes of those particular models of leadership and contribution to society could actually be streamlined and made a part of the national mechanism that ensures, well, that makes space for such things, that would be really, really good. Sorry, I hope that helps. Dr. Vili, I think, would have much more to offer than me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the audience, Kichi from EVI. Kichi, if you would like the floor to ask your question, I will read out a question for the panelists. It's actually directed to all the panelists.
Thanks, Gabriel. Sorry, my question is to all the panelists. Just interested to hear your views on the role of international volunteers in particular in promoting and supporting local volunteerism and building resilience in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Kichi. Yeah, that question, feel free, speakers and panelists, to answer that question, take that question.
So I'll just read the question again in case it was missed. How do you see the role of international volunteers in particular in promoting and supporting local volunteerism and building resilience in the Pacific? Dr. Vili, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you, Alana, for putting me on the spot on this. Yeah, well, thank you. That is a very important question. As I share that, I was taught by international volunteers, the Peace Corps, the Australian volunteers, when I was in Samoa, and I think they played a really critical value in the capacity building and in the education system in Samoa. So deeply grateful about that. Whether there is a place, yes, 100%. I think the roles of international volunteers is very important because they bring a set of knowledge as well. They bring a global context. They have been familiarized with tools. They have been trained in different ways of doing things. And I know that there is also a training for volunteers to understand the culture and the local context. And I have seen that being useful in different settings. But I am saying this, that given that is very important, but at the same time, we really need to build the capacity of our local volunteers, the volunteers in country. And we need to find a way to complement the international volunteers working to complement the capacity or to complement the skill sets of the local volunteers, and finding a framework where the international volunteers fit in a national systems, and where the national volunteers fit in order to provide feedback and work backward to inform or improve the international volunteers processes and systems and capacity. So The worst part from my own experience, that's why I shared so much about the localization action. The localization approach is that during disasters, the damage assessment, and this is very chaotic moment, and this is the most vulnerable moments of our communities just after cyclones or after tsunami. We see a lot of international actors coming in and going all around as well at that time. So sometimes I say there is a role, but find the perfect timing for that role and how it fits in the local context and the local settings when it's needed the most. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share. But I really appreciate the role of the international volunteers. Thank you.
Just to add to that.
Valuable, Dr. Vil. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that.
Just quickly, Gabby, I think Pitaumi's got a few comments to add. So please, Dr. Pitaumi, take it away.
Just to add to that, I work for an organization that specializes in experiential study abroad learning experiences here in Samoa. And it is the goal of this whole experience to create global citizens, social justice oriented young people who have a lot to contribute. And so, as Dr. Vili has already alluded to, they come in country and they have so much to learn. And so it's these young people who also then become ambassadors for the countries that they belong to, and they play a huge role in the connections that are made between us here at the local level, and how they can also advocate for the work that we do here as locals. There's a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas between our young people here in Samoa and those that come here in Samoa. So there's a huge hybridization, cross-fertilization of ideas that takes place in this interaction between the locals and the internationals that do come to Samoa. And so I totally believe in the role that they play in enhancing the opportunities available to our local volunteers, but at the same time, as Dr. Vili has shared, the need to strengthen and look for solutions from within, using our own structures and constructs, I think is where we need to head in order for us to strengthen our and be resilient ourselves as volunteers here in the Pacific, using, of course, constructs from outside. Thank you.
Thank you for that addition, Dr. Tony. Much appreciated in that. Yeah, so we have a speaker and a question for Simona. Simona is joining us from Samoa. Simona is the resident coordinator for the Samoa Multi-Country Office. She's the resident coordinator based out of Samoa. So I'll now hand over the floor to her. She has her hand raised as well. Simona,
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gabi. And please accept apologies. I will not be able to turn on the video. It's past the point of the night here. So I'm joining you from Geneva a few hours before Samoa presents its third Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights to the Human Rights Council here. But I just wanted to make sure I do not miss this opportunity to clarify a little bit how important volunteers are to the United Nations. And then I will go ahead into providing a quick answer to your question as to how international volunteers can change a little bit the dynamics in the society in the Pacific and generate more local volunteers. So first of all, the UNV was established as an associated program of UNDP out of a specific need. There was a need to bring in energy, new thoughts, new knowledge, fresh knowledge from young professionals who would like to better understand the international development cooperation community, and who are actually willing to start their careers by contributing their knowledge and their skills to the public good and to the broader good. Over decades of working with the United Nations Volunteers Organization, we actually achieved a lot together, and we have constantly provided reports to the member states on the great work that volunteers are doing. So it's very, very difficult to actually quantify the results that volunteers themselves bring to the work of the United Nations, but I can definitely tell you that in everything we do, at least in the countries in the Pacific and the countries I cover, there is an input provided by the volunteers. And I'll start first by referring to the actual human rights review tomorrow that takes place in Geneva, before the Human Rights Council, with the government stakeholders presenting the report. The report of the country is accompanied by the report of the United Nations, who was prepared with the support of a volunteer who I can see in the room in Samoa, Tiffany Chan, a colleague of us who has worked very, very thoroughly on the UN compilation of inputs into the human rights report, and who has provided, from a legal standpoint, very valuable analysis throughout. I'm also joined in the implementation of programs in Samoa by another volunteer, Yul Biti, who has been able to manage, to provide management support to joint programs by UN agencies across many areas in which we work, from developing a knowledge society in Samoa to working on the rights of persons with disabilities in Cook Islands, and again, social protection and other programs. I will not be able to do justice to all of the volunteers who have contributed over the last 4 years to the work of the United Nations, but there are other interns and junior consultants also in the room. I saw Marina as well, and other colleagues who made us a better partner of the government and of the societies for which we work. And I'm preparing a piece that will be published within and on all the websites of the United Nations, in which I'm sharing my experience in working with young professionals and working with volunteers in particular in my career in the United Nations, because I think we owe to these young people who come again before they clarify their career path to put all their time, all their passion and knowledge into ensuring that the United Nations delivers more and better. I will come to the question that you raised that I found extremely interesting. So first of all, my own lesson in the Pacific is that the Pacific culture is founded on a lot of volunteerism. In my discussion with the previous Prime Minister in Samoa, he expressed at some point his views that once volunteerism has been monetized and services provided to the community expected a reward and a prize, some of its value has been lost. But the reality is that whatever form of volunteerism in the society in Samoa, in the villages, in support of community organizations, in support of the church, in support of the families in the community, is a great lesson for us to learn. So I think it's a mutual learning process. Our international volunteers learning from what people are providing for their communities and for their families through volunteerism, and of course locals to learn from the international UNVs. I wish I could report here that over years we recruited more national volunteers. That's not the case, and I think a question mark for the UNV is why that didn't happen, and how we can practically change the makeup of volunteers in our countries and see more national volunteers enrolled into the support of the activities of the United Nations. It's a great learning opportunity. You can only understand the complexity of the work of the United Nations if you spend some time inside and you engage with UN agencies and you see how UN agencies deliver policy services and other types of services in country. And then many of the volunteers would also better understand where exactly they could make a stronger contribution. Is the UN a potential employer? Is the UN does the UN have a mandate in which young professionals believe and want to support? So you can only get those answers if you come and work within the organization and with the organization in a very specific country context. And I think there are lots of lessons learned that volunteers can share themselves. And I listen to you, and it is indeed great to see how much you guys have to share and how much you have achieved and how much you believe in your mission. I think it's fundamentally a matter of believing in what you're doing. And let me also say that there is also a lot that the United Nations itself learns from the volunteers we work with. UN agencies can definitely make a better assessment as to where the gaps are, where the institutional gaps are, and how volunteers could fill such gaps, but also understand how the society is changing by simply engaging with young volunteers, young professionals who come to the United Nations to make their own contribution to our work. We learn how, again, the society is changing, what exactly future generations are looking into, how we can draw on that particular value and do more for the people we serve. So we need to allow ourselves, the ones who are no longer young, no longer volunteers, to learn from the young professionals who are joining us. I also want to put on the record that we do have an issue in ensuring that we provide career support to the volunteers. We don't have solutions for some of them. We know they are valuable. We know that they could do a lot working with us. We still do not know how to best integrate them. I know UNVs are working, the UN volunteer organizations is working a lot on that, but there is a lot more that we could do if we really want to change the dynamic into the UN to, again, lower the average age of the organization and make an organization that is informed by the needs of young generations and future generations. We absolutely have that obligation to enable that process of change in the UN, and it needs to start with providing career development solutions to volunteers. And I'm just willing to close by saying that I thank you all. It's always a pleasure to join those conversations, and I very much hope that we all acknowledge in full, understanding and full sincerity, if you wish, the value that UN volunteers bring to the United Nations. It's an not sufficiently paid kind of contribution. There are gaps in benefits that we would need to explore together to ensure that we do justice to our young professionals, to specialists as well, specialist UNVs, and then continue to change by learning from the younger newcomers in the organization. So I thank you very much indeed. And I also want to tell my team in Samoa that I'm very grateful for all the preparations done in support of the third Universal Periodic Review of Samoa that starts in a few hours. And I hope you will join me in wishing Samoa good luck with a quite complicated review that will start in just a few hours from now. Thank you very much. Over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Simona, for sharing your insights on that. Very appreciated. Yeah, we have a question as well for Lepani. Lepani, the question is posted in the chat. Bridging the gap. How can international, local, or community volunteers work together to make an impact on society? Working together, how can international and local or community volunteers make a positive impact on society? So these are international and local volunteers.
Thank you, Gabriel. Just to answer that question, that of course we have to acknowledge that the local volunteers do face circumstances or struggles in terms of financing, in terms of resources, and the fact that overseas volunteers who are linked to Pacific Island countries do have that surplus in terms of finance and resources. This is where they will meet in terms of providing the manpower on the ground, community engagement, and also with the finances and also with the resources that's going to be supplied by overseas volunteers. But in terms of personal volunteers and not in terms of monetary and resources, one thing that they can do to help is with capacity building. I think in my short experience in volunteering in the communities, community organizers and volunteers tend to just do the work just to tick in a box. Not for many community groups, just for some, and that's one of the struggles that we face on the grassroots level. And in order to change that mindset or the type of working, bringing in capacity building from overseas on how to do assessments, on how to avoid duplication, and for better coordination of resources, the guidance and the technical advice, and also through funding and supplying of resources and finance, can better equip local and community volunteers. For example, if another Winston comes in Fiji, there is not much preparatory work done to go and visit and supply needs for a community. The capacity building and also the technical advice that will be done to the community volunteers to avoid duplication and also avoid problems that in relation to the assessments that could better equip the local volunteers to do their work much better, and also for them to assess those who are really in need. So that's the two things, mobilizing of finances and resources, and also the technical advice, and also the assessments, and also the avoiding of duplication. Those knowledge and skills and resources and also finances can be transferred to the local to empower them to do much better in effective work in the community level. So yes, that's all from my end, Gabriel.
Lepani, yeah, thank you for speaking to that on community and international volunteers, particularly on grassroots. Thank you for that conversation. So I'll hand over. We have a question for Vileni. Let me just post that in the chat. It's on how can we create inclusive environments to allow volunteers in marginalized groups, young people, women, children, and people living with disabilities to make meaningful contributions when volunteering for resilience.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you, Gabby, and thank you for the question. I guess for myself, as a person with disability, I'm facing barriers, even when I started the age of volunteerism in my younger age. But throughout my experiences in volunteerism, for all the work I had, my experiences in the civil society, not only in the organization of persons with disabilities, ensuring an inclusive environment for all is to work together. That's always been my motto, working together in the society. Yeah? So we have, just to give you illustrate you an example, we have a team here in Palau. We started off, it's more an ad hoc, that we start off with government, civil society, government organizations, civil society, private sectors, and other groups that we work towards the inclusive development for persons with disabilities. That's for disability sector. But for the civil society, we have the organization as more like an umbrella organization for all the civil societies that includes local and traditional groups. So we have that platform, a coordinating mechanism that we consist of all different civil societies, organizations ranging from youth, women, children, older people, even to the traditional and local groups. And we don't limit those local and traditional groups that are not registered as a non-government organization to join in our group. And we come in together and we see, okay, what are those, who are those vulnerable groups that are in this community, in the society that we can that we are advocating for, that we are championing in those issues, and how we can leverage our resources, pool our resources, mobilize our local resources. Because, you know, coming from a small island country, we always have limited resources, and we always ask funding. So rather than depending on the international community for such funding and resources, we come in together, pull in our resources, whether it's human resources, financial resources, capacity building. We come together and we build from there of who are those vulnerable groups in the community, what resources that we can tap into, local mobilizing our resources so we can look into. And then the last thing is, what are those priority actions that we prioritize, and then we move forward from there. So these are the approaches. There's so many approaches that I've gone through, believe it or not, in my experience, as that I've worked in the disability sector for more than 2 decades. I have experiences in the civil society, and this also doesn't limit us from working together with the government organization, with the private sector and other institutions. So this is more of a whole society approach. You can see my presentation, we use the approach called community-based inclusive development, and that's where we pull everyone together, a whole of society. If not just disability is for everyone's responsibility, it's everyone. It's including children, women, young people, older people, indigenous people. These are everyone's responsibility. So it takes collective action. It takes whole of society approach to move forward our actions. Yes, we have competing priorities at the national level, regional, going beyond, but it's just a matter of how we prioritize our priorities and leveraging resources to move forward, at least taking a step forward, working together as one community. Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you very much, Vileni. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on this and from a personal experience as well. Now I will hand over to Alana for the rapporteur's briefing. Alana, over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're slightly running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up our summaries real quick. Our key summaries, I suppose, is that volunteers, in order to do their roles well and better, training is needed, availability is needed, creating pathways for professionalism, especially for youth, like internships, support mechanisms for mental health is needed. There is a need to establish a form of governance mechanism for volunteerism, for resilience in the islands, who is doing what, where, when, why, and available resources. This helps to align actions, harmonize actions, and improve efficiency, working with faith-based organizations, volunteer-based organizations, and local communities is needed. The power of outreach is needed. Youth volunteers, they're in the forefront of building resilient communities. So leveraging their capacity is key. And ways to do this is through social media platforms that we have today, like the good works of what Unu Foundation, an example of how that can be achieved. We do have a list of more summaries, but I am running out of time. We will be sending these summaries to the ADB in Manila, but I'd just like to thank everyone for their comments. We will be sure to include all of those in our notes to the organisers as well. From me, I'm going to say kia orana, kia manoia. Thank you to all our speakers, all our everyone that tuned in to listen into this session. It's been really appreciative. And back over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Alana. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you to the participants. We acknowledge our comments and notes. We will include them in our notes to the organizers with EDB, GIZ, and UNV. Just because of time, we will conclude this conversation, but there is more yet to be in the future on this space, in the similar space. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And have a great afternoon.
Can we have a photo?
If you know how to take the photo, Dr. Levy, then really be my guest. I have no idea how to do that.
It's the same with me. I just know how to smile.
I can do that. Let's all, if you want, let's all take a photo. Turn on your camera, keep it off, whichever you prefer. We'll just take a quick one. You have to hold on while I'll need to take two actually.
Now I see all of you, you all look very beautiful.
Wow, where have you been hiding, people? Okay, hold on. All right, the first one. 1, 2, 3.
Can they say volunteer?
1, 2, 3, say volunteer.
Are we saying it now?
Say it now.
Volunteer. This is B
Okay,
for
I'll
volunteer.
take a second one.
B for volunteer.
Take a second one because we have a lot of participants. Say volunteer.
Volunteer. Thank you very much, everyone. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We've got that.
Stay safe and keep
so much for
volunteering.
joining us. Yeah.
Thank you and all the best.
Thank you.